It's been a major shape of the globe over the last 200 period, what the British colonial project has done. And it is direct morphing, I think, into capitalism. It's not a minor issue on some funky little tourist nation, on the edge of Europe. It's a major problem.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Nick Duffell about the wounded leaders produced by the elite boarding school system and how their psychology has shaped the war. While the elite boarding school system might not seem like a significant issue, you've undoubtedly experienced the long-term consequences of leaders raised within this system, who include everyone from Donald Trump to Tony Blair. During this episode, we explore how the psychology created by this unique childhood experience has shaped everything from global capitalism to colonialism, and determined the history of the British Empire and, by extension, the world. We also explore how leaders can change their psychology, integrate these experiences, and better connect with the people they serve. Now, here is Nick. I am fascinated by the subject of your work on multiple levels because I'm really interested in psychohistory. I've loved the work of Lloyd DeMoss for a long time. And I'm also really interested in the impact that schooling has on people, and have been interested in the work of people like John Taylor Gatto and the unschooling movement and things like that. So you have a unique intersection of them in the stuff that you've written about on the unique personalities that are created by boarding school. And I wanted to know how you got interested in that, how it is that you first became curious about this sort of psychological impact of schooling and in particular elite boarding schools.
Okay. Well, I think it happened in stages for me, Brendon. And the first one I would go back to, maybe I'll tell you just a tiny bit about my background. As that my father came from the East End of London, which used to be, the rough part of town, which of course it's now full of hipsters and slow drip coffee. But in those days, that was the place not to come from. It's it's like the Lower East Side or somewhere like that. And see, he was a young man during the war, and in that time, the very rigid British class system got a bit dynamic because everyone was sort of pulling together. And my father went into the army as a private and came out a major, unheard of for in general, but the sort of thing that happened during the war. And he was an achiever, and he had my name down for an English boarding school, which is the way in Britain that a family goes up the class system. So it meant that if you go to a school like that, you would come out with what we call a posh accent or an Oxford accent, and not a regional accent, not a Cockney accent like he had and was trying to disguise. And he married a posh girl, and so the aspirational trajectory went on. And so this was not long after the end of the war. And actually, as he rose up his career, he was working for an American corporation for Hoover, and he had to open an office in Germany. That was his big chance. So we lived in Germany, and I went to the local army school, and every year, every term, they had a different regiment in, and when I used to come back with whatever regional accent the regiment came from, and it was driving my father crazy. And when I came back with a Geordie accent, that's a Newcastle accent, he said, "Enough is enough. You've got to go to boarding school now." So I was sent off to a boarding school, and I was sent, in his wisdom, a school in Europe. And actually, I went to an American school. And so my first 3 years of boarding, where I did my own separation, was at an American school. And then I had to come back to a British school. And I can remember, because the American school was actually benign. And I remember coming back into this strange kind of schooling in Britain that I, even at 13 years old, said, it's just, there's something wrong about this. It's not right, the way I'm being treated as a child. but then I had to go through it, of course, and survive. And then as a young man, I'd gone to Oxford apparently to read PPE, because I was sent to an aspirational school too. PPE is the big subject for sort of go-ahead people, politics, economics, and philosophy. It's what Cameron read. And it was 1968, and we were sort of choosing a different life for ourselves, that generation. And I changed my degree course to read Oriental languages. And when I eventually got into India, I got a job in India, I was incredibly surprised how kind all the Indians were to me, how well I was treated. Why I didn't understand why they didn't hate me, because I knew the history of the British Raj, and I thought, why aren't these people hating me? And I wondered what had happened to them. And it wasn't until a good 20 years later, I started to get the idea that, is it possible that the British had defeated the Indians in a way from the inside, psychologically? And I was working, I'd had a breakdown. After Oxford, I became a carpenter. And I worked for 15 years with my hands, and, I still do it. But, and I started to question all these things about the British establishment, which I was supposed to be joining. And I was then working in what was called the men's movement at the time, working in men's groups. And I realized there were quite a few people like me who had been who sort of come from quite elite families, but had a sort of quality of woundedness to them. And that's when I started to look into the boarding school thing. And what sort of shocked me was when I did a literature survey that nothing had been written psychologically on the issues of sending children away from sort of ostensibly elite and loving families into institutions like for 10 years. It's very, very common in Britain, and what effect that would have on the people. And so I went through these studies, and I realized actually it was a design process thought up in the 19th century to create people to administer, the British Empire, and one of the ways that this was done very simply is that the children were sent away, the attachments were broken, or the connections to the family were broken, and with that, the child was taught to dissociate, not just to suppress feelings, but dissociate from feelings, dissociate from all vulnerability. And that was necessary if you were going to survive in the Northwest frontier, with very few. I mean, the manpower that they ran the British Empire with is quite staggering. The German magazine Spiegel, Geschichte, History, said the British did the empire on the cheap, and they were right. So it meant you had to be able to take difficult conditions, not want comfort. And the boarding schools was the training for this. So this is a long story, but so then I realized that actually, in order to dissociate from your vulnerability completely, it was necessary to have somebody around quite close to you who you labeled the vulnerable one, or the savage one, or the stupid one, or the incompetent one. And this whole sort of natives played that role for the British. So the Indians were the sort of the non-rational, emotional savages, which helped the British feel superior. And the thing was that it's such a strong sort of, in psychotherapy it's called projective identification, such a strong force that the Indians actually ended up believing it. So then I realized I'd stumbled on something really fundamental and important about the British psyche, about actually leadership in general, and about actually modernism in general, because I realized this whole dissociation process was the same force that made the whole sort of Victorian modernist movement, able to do the colonial project without having a conscience, for example. Learned dissociation. Wow. So my work has, just as you said in the beginning, it has to do with psychology, has to do with education, has to do with politics. And so when I was trying to publish my first book, The Making of Them, it's a bargain. It was very hard to get a publisher because they didn't know what shelf to put it on. Yeah, so, and what I see is now, as I call myself a psychohistorian, is that all the creative work these days, in a way, has to be multidisciplinary. You have to come out from all kinds of perspectives on things.
There's a lot of really interesting things in what you said. One of them is that the elite boarding schools were the path to the elite part of British society. And I think that's important for people who might not be familiar with the English boarding school system, because there might be like, oh, why does this matter? And it's like, because everyone who's a leader in the society, who shaped colonialism, who shaped the British Empire, which then shaped the world, was a psychological product of this system.
Pretty much.
And one of the things I found really interesting in what you said is that it was intentionally designed. So I want to ask more about that. Designed to do what, and designed by whom, and how does it accomplish this process?
Yes. Well, there had been a long tradition of schools for the gentry in British society, going right back to the Middle Ages. So you've got schools like Winchester and Eton coming out of from the 14th century. Yeah. And there was a long tradition of sending the sons of the gentry to these places, also sending the younger sons into the monasteries, and also sending one of the sons to the home of another nobleman. Yeah. So that's a long tradition in Britain, and it was remarked upon by Italian visitors, for example, to medieval Britain. And where that comes from, I don't know.
Are you talking about the medieval system of apprenticeship, that people would go and study a craft under someone?
I'm more talking about the gentry.
Okay, so there was even an institutional schooling system during the Middle Ages that involved leaving home and going somewhere else.
Yes, but of course it was, of course, for a long time, education was limited to the gentry or limited to the clergy. See, but so in the 19th century, the idea of more generalized education starts to come in as a product of the Enlightenment. You see, and what these school systems became known in Britain as public schools, and that's very confusing to American audience, because public schools in America means what it says. They're for the public. In Britain, they're actually private schools, but they were in the turn of the century. They were created as public schools, as charitable foundations, so as not only for the gentry sons, to include the sons of wealthy manufacturers, etc. You see, and what I realized in the course of my research, actually sort of quite late on, is that the great heyday of the British schooling system was in the 1850s, 1860s, and that's post-industrial revolution. So they were looking at schools as a kind of industrial process, and I first noticed that when I started to do interviews with people who'd been through the schooling system like myself, but this time with a sort of a meta view on it. And one of the things people said consistently was, it's as if you'd come out of a machine, you were like kind of a sausage machine. You were all meant to turn out the same. And what I noticed when I started this work, because in Britain, people are very curious, they want to know names of schools, and I would say it has nothing to do with the name of the school. it's a system here, and there's an attitude to children. And there's an attitude to, that's what my first book was subtitled, The British Attitude to Children. And the idea is that the child, under this modernist view, which I call, in my own words, I call it the rational man project, that you're trying to turn out rational men, and the child is unmade before it goes to one of these schools. And when the child goes through, the child will be made, will be a rational man. And there's a tremendous similarity in the way these schools operated and the sort of products of the schools, so that you could say that the sort of English sort of gentleman turned out by these schools was quite, like a national character ideal, quite recognizable, really a product. It wasn't designed to produce individualism. It was designed to produce a kind of esprit de corps, loyalty to class, loyalty to country, loyalty to regiment, blah, blah, because they're also quite militaristic. Yeah. And that's designed into the system. And the way that was going to be done, the very first step is to break the original loyalty. And the original loyalty is to family, starting with a mother, and the internal language of the child, which is emotions. So breaking those two deliberately is a way of breaking the will of the child, and then you remake the child into a rational man. And I was later, I found my hypothesis was borne out by the fact that there was a very, very interesting initiative in Canada a few years ago. The government of Canada commissioned a big program of investigation into the residential schools in which the children of the Indigenous Canadians were put. And they commissioned this report because there were widespread abuse allegations which were being upheld by the courts, and it was costing, in particular, the Church of Canada a lot of money. And so they produced this incredible report, both of the history and the interviewing with people, and you can see it. It's a downloadable PDF on the internet. And in this, there's records of the Canadian Parliament in 1888 saying, look, you can see how successful these boarding schools have been back in the home country. Let's do it here. This is exactly the thing to do with the native children. And then they said, and we'll do it on the cheap. We'll get the church to run it. And so you get that deliberate design thing in, and, it's still going on. And we're still working off that sort of mindset and still producing people who are often very competent on the outside, but actually very fragile psychologically, because they're sitting on a lot of dissociation. That's quite a fragile system in the psyche.
It's an important point too, because I've heard a lot of people talk about the abuses that occurred to Indigenous people under colonialism. But one of the things that your work reveals is that the abuses they enacted on others were things they first experienced in childhood. And there was a system in place in the British Islands that was practiced on their own people before it was ever practiced on other peoples.
Yes, that's right. Practiced and refined, you see, refined.
So,
and it's very successful.
Yeah, it's been, successful is also a very relative definition. It's been successful at maybe a goal that was not worth pursuing in the first place, or was somewhat misguided. It also strikes me the discourse of calling them public schools when it sounds like they very clearly served the interests of the gentry. Like, we'll take your children, we'll make them elite, but it will cost you their loyalty to you. In other words, they're not going to be loyal to the family, and they're not going to be loyal to their own, true self or own personal emotions. They're going to be loyal to the interests of the nation state, which we're creating. And we as the lords will give up some power to do that, quote unquote, giving it up. But in the process, we're going to have power over the next generation and power over them psychologically.
Yes, but you've also got to... Sorry, I'm sorry. Go on. Sorry.
Well, no, go ahead with what you were going to say.
Well, I think one of the things to remember that what's happening during the Victorian period is in Britain, you've got the Industrial Revolution, which means you've got a new class of people coming up owning wealth. So wealth is not just produced by the land, wealth is produced by enterprise and, of course, by banking. Yeah. And so you've got all the foundations of modern predatory capitalism being, practiced in the 19th century, refining it to what it is now, this unassailable beast. And you've got big transitions in British society. So where once it was the gentry, now you have a section of the upper class, and then the nouveau riche coming in. And you have to have a system which is standardizing these people and bringing them into the top levels of society. And the boarding school does that perfectly with its homogenized accent and its homogenized system of development and of values, yeah, and the understanding of hierarchy. And in all these schools, which of course were designed by men for men, even though later on girls were put through them, you have very familiar systems in male in male structures of the puffing up of the ego and then the breaking of it. So you have these hierarchies where you're always becoming a new boy at some level, and then you eat dirt, and then you're on the top again, and then you're enforcing the system that you went through, which is exactly what happens in the British House of Commons now, for example. Yeah. So the society is reinventing himself still in a sort of stratified way. And what's interesting is that the sort of old country houses got increasingly expensive to keep up in the mid-19th century. And if you go and look at any of the big British public schools, private boarding schools, they're mostly set in country houses and lovely grounds, which are now rugby pitches and cricket pitches. Yeah, so it's a way of sort of compensating for the old world that's going, reintroducing that elitism right into the schools. Yeah. So the school is set in the country house. So the parent, who is actually the customer, drives up to this country house with their child to dump them there and goes, wow, of course we're doing the right thing, So it's very self-reinforcing. And that's what I mean by successful. Where it's not successful is you actually can look at, say, the history of the Conservative Party, the Tory Party in Britain, which... the great economist William Hutton has written about this. He says, if you look at them closely, it's a series of very, very poor decision-making. And of course, what we know now is that in order to make good decision-making, you've got to have emotional intelligence in place. That's been proven through the work of Antonio Damasio and neuroscience. Yeah. And we also know now that in order to be resilient, you need good attachments. Whereas before it was thought resilience, you need to be kicked out and brought up on a desert island. No, it's not true. There's very good research now coming out that show the most resilient people are the best attached.
It sounds like there was a system in place in which that sort of cold ruthlessness was rewarded, And now we live in a system where that's actually very dangerous to have the people who are in leadership in society behaving that way and coming from that consciousness. I also noticed in this system that there is a way in which if someone who's been through that system questions it, that in some way they are also questioning a system that privileged them a lot and has put them at the top of society, and that questioning it might mean also questioning the foundations of their own privilege. In other words, if they say that this system that put me on top is bad, maybe I shouldn't be on top. Or maybe the way that I got on top I have to question, or some other ideas might come up.
Well, you're completely right. You see, this has been one of the great difficulties. I mean, you're quite right to point the finger in that direction. I think it's very, very, it's very complex. There's a very simple thing: is that human beings were brought up to be. We evolved to be brought up in family groups and live in small bands of other family groups. Yeah, and we were not brought up to be an institute. We were not designed to live in institutions with hundreds of people of the same age and gender. That's completely wrong. And privilege. This is what I was saying was this is where it gets quite complicated, because you've got the simple fact, as I was saying, that human beings have evolved to grow up, to be brought up in family groups, in small bands, blah, 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 and not in single gender institutions with numerous people of the same age as you. There's not one theory of child development that recommends it. Yeah.
Right.
So that you'd think people would consider that when thinking about the boarding school. But then you've got the other thing of privilege. So you've got a system which I would say is neglect, and I call it normalized neglect. It's willful neglect, and it's normalized. And as we were saying before, there's a purpose to it. And willful normalized neglect is dangerous in itself, in that that's the context where inevitably you get abuse occurring. You can't prevent it, really. But then if you add in privilege, this becomes very weird in the system. So you get the situation where people who've been through this privilege and been neglected and perhaps abused, or in one way or another experience the trauma of being away from home from a young age for maybe 10 years, haven't dared to speak up about it because they have an internal shaming process which says, listen, mate, you had this incredible, remember the facilities, you look what the kids around the corner have got. You're going to complain? Yeah. And, or when you bring this thing to the national media, even to the sort of left-wing newspaper, or not a liberal newspaper like The Guardian, which is a bit like the New York Times, and you say, look, there's a problem with boarding schools, and they say, are you crazy? There's much more pressing issues in the world. Yeah. And so there's a sort of the thing about privilege is there's both a sort of a shaming about talking about the system which doesn't work, and there is the opposite effect, that those people who've been through the system of the boarding school and not allowed themselves to acknowledge the traumatic nature of it have lots of self-reinforcing things like, it never did me any harm, it's character building, it made me a man, blah, all this sort of stuff, the usual kind of things that you're familiar from any sort of macho narrative. Yeah. And then come out with a sort of sense of entitlement. And they feel they're entitled to rule. They feel they're entitled to be on this elite path. And it's also very difficult to look at. I mean, look at our current leaders. The sense of entitlement's just, you can smell it. And so I had a lot of difficulty with that myself, because I'm a bit of a natural lefty, and I was kind of against that. And what I realized through my psychological work, because it's not just a history, it's also clinical work together, is that the only way I could understand this, that the entitlement complex which these people had is actually a compensation for irredeemable loss. Loss of childhood, loss of emotional spontaneity, loss of the natural self, loss of home, something these children are never going to get back to. And that's compensated. Yeah.
So they went through this really difficult thing, but the reward they got from that was, if you go through this, then you get to be elite, you get to have this incredible sense of entitlement. And if you don't even get the entitlement, what do you have at the end of that? Well, then you just have the pain.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I was in my clinical work, the first thing I did when I started to come out with this in 1990 is I was by sheer luck, someone whose roof I'd fixed when I was a carpenter realized I had retrained myself. I had a breakdown. I was doing a sort of qualifying thesis on this boarding school thing I discovered, and I sent this woman a leaflet of the program of workshops I'd invented, and she said, "Wow, this is amazing. I'm looking for someone to write a newspaper column about it's a for and against thing. I can't find anyone to do against boarding. Will you do it?" I said, "Wow." And this was 1990. They paid me £1,000 to write this piece. I couldn't believe it. Journalists don't get that anymore. Anyway, I wasn't even a journalist. So I wrote this piece, and the Independent newspaper, which was another liberal newspaper that existed then, got the biggest mailbag they'd ever had. And all these letters were delivered through the door of my flat, because that was pre-email. And a lot of people saying, "Thank God, someone is speaking up about this finally. I've been too ashamed," or "My husband is blah, blah, blah," or, "Thank God someone is saying it." So that's when I realized I'd really touched on a nerve. All these people were silenced because of the privileged. And then as I start to work it out clinically, I started to say I could roughly define three groups of what I called boarding school survivors. And I use that word as a tremendous provocation, you see, to get people to think, boarding school survivors? Are you kidding? This tremendous social privilege? Yes, you have to survive it. You have to survive. Every child has to survive being sent away from home, I say. Yeah? And they do it, slightly differently. But I divide my boarding school survivors into three types. The first one I call the compliers. That's the biggest group. That's the ones who readily join the establishment. And it's a kind of a Stockholm syndrome. Yeah. And the second I call the rebels, and I had counted myself as one of them. When I was working as a carpenter, I met quite a lot of very educated carpenters. There's quite a few out there, people who absolutely didn't want to go on and be a success, because, or as I later realized, people who had experienced very bad authorities, and their own sense of authority, their own potential, they threw it all out, baby in bathwater, you see. And then there was a small group I called the crushed, because some people didn't survive it. Actually, the bullying that goes on is terrible in those establishments, as you probably know, you call it, this hazing rituals that you have in American prep schools and things. Some people, what I reasoned clinically is that a child who can't put up a decent survival personality is going to have a very tough time in 10 years in an institution with other boys who are all equally scared, away from home, and able to break rules terribly easily. get into trouble all the time, and have to keep what I call strategic survival personality going. Stay strategic.
So what is the strategic survival personality? In other words, what do you have to become in this system in order to survive?
Well, the strategic survival personality, I said, you have to survive. It's not just you went to a school and got terribly badly bullied and therefore you're a kind of survivor. No, you have to survive as a child living between sort of ages of 8 and 18 without any parents. As a young child, you have to survive the withholding of all levels of touch and affection, and as a sort of young adolescent, you have to go through puberty in an institution. Now, going through puberty is bad enough for all of us. Incredibly confusing developmental period, and your sexual centers are going crazy, and your growth centers are going crazy. And to do that without any privacy and not in a home is terribly difficult. So everybody has to survive it, but plus you're living in a regimented institution where the rules are quite strong, because they're trying to enforce a sort of a top-down hierarchical system based on rules of conduct and attitudes. So there are endless rules to try to keep all these boys in check. And they are mostly enforced by other boys, older boys. So in order to save money on the sort of administration and organizing of schools, they use the other boys, but at the same time, it's giving this sort of dog eat dog hierarchical model reality, and it's practice at all this. So it's terribly easy to do the wrong thing, to get into trouble. You could, lots of petty rules, like anyone who's not a sixth former would have to have their jacket button done up at any time, otherwise they break a rule, for example, something stupid like that. Break this rule 3 times, you're going to get corporal punishment. In my day, not today, of course, corporal punishment's gone, but the insistence of a whole load of trivia to keep the authority of the institution going, and to teach the boys the pecking order situation.
So there's a long list of rules, many of them arbitrary, which are enforced by every level of the institution, including its members. And it trains them to internalize those rules and enforce them on each other.
And you become strategic in how you respond, so that later in life, let's say, Brendon, let's say you're a boarding school survivor, let's say 20 years after leaving school.
I'm actually a private Christian school survivor, which is its own slightly different set of challenges.
I'm sure. And you just got rid of a president, thankfully, who was a military boarding school survivor, who has quite a lot of these characteristics.
That's interesting.
Oh yeah. And so let's say 20 years after leaving boarding school, your wife calls out in your apartment, she calls out, "Brendon," and if you've got a strategic survival personality running, you're going to go into quickly, what did I do wrong? You're going to go, you're going to go in with your best innocent face, or you're going to pretend you didn't hear her. And actually, she might be saying, "Brendon, just come here and rub my neck, sweetheart." So the problem is that you bring your survival personality into intimate relationships and into family life. As after that 10-year training, it's hard not to do it.
So for 10 years, all of the child's relationships are based on not connection or anything emotional or emotionally intimate. They're based on a series of social games in arbitrary rules, which then are
yes,
generalized, and the defenses of it are generalized to all relationships.
yes, and there are certain ground rules which sort of really principles is that you mustn't show vulnerability. So that starts at the age of 7 or 8. You're not allowed to show you miss your mummy. Yeah, that's where it starts. So, and that easily gets mixed with the normal sort of patriarchal training for boys, like, you know, don't be weak, be strong, you know, which we know from all cultures, most cultures, certainly post-industrial cultures. The confusion of vulnerability and weakness, well, they are not the same things, but they are under a system like this, which means that you, in the end, you don't know what vulnerability is, actually, when you've been dissociating vulnerability for 10 years. So you cannot understand the vulnerable in society. So you cannot come out as a good political leader and deal with the vulnerable in society, because actually your job as a leader is also to look after the vulnerable. You know, that's the job description. You know, understand what that means. So, which is, maybe you could argue that's why these kind of types of leaders have made such a mess of COVID. Yeah, because they just don't quite get it. It means that you can't really understand if your wife has feelings. You can't understand that she's actually trying to share something with you. You think it's you think you're in trouble, and you try to and you go into defensive mode, or you make her bad about it. Which again is a classic sort of patriarchal mistake. But you're really instantly, you're very, very finely tuned to that sort of response, because what happens in dissociation is you're actually running various identity propositions. So you're saying, I am not the vulnerable one. It's immediately, you're the vulnerable one, you're the wrong one, you're the incompetent one, comes out of that level of identity proposition. So it's terribly rigid and very bad long-term in intimate relationships, that kind of thing.
I want to know more about that aspect of projection, where it sounds like, since it's not okay for people in that system to be the vulnerable one, or the one who's weak, or the one who misses their parents, or anything like that, there is a desire or a psychological need to project that onto others, and that the bullying in that system is a result of that. It's like shaming this part of them that they see reflected externally in someone else.
Yes, that's right.
And so how does that manifest? And then what is the strategy around bullying there? I guess I want to understand more about that, because it sounds like you mentioned earlier that then also became generalized to the various people that this element of British leadership later colonized. So then they saw the Native Americans as like, oh, you must be the emotional weak ones, like those people I knew back in boarding school who I don't want to be like.
Yes, exactly. And it's quite a well-known function in Jungian psychology. So the Jungians were the first to recognize what's called the scapegoating syndrome. So where you have one person who carries the unwanted, the disowned elements for the group. So the group needs the scapegoat. There's a very, very close relationship between the group and the scapegoat. So if you think the groups that are in boarding schools are groups of children away from home with no one to care for them, trying not to look scared, trying not to look vulnerable, you have an added dimension, is the one who looks like they might sort of cry, give the game away that they're all vulnerable. This is a catastrophic fantasy amongst young boarding children, which is not conscious, but everybody gets it. If one of the kids cries, perhaps we're all going to cry. We're all going to miss our mamas. Yeah. Right. So, but this is going on unconsciously. So the bullying, let's get and nail this kid who might be the vulnerable one. So in a way, that's part of the scapegoating function. The other thing which is happening is that the process of dissociating and disowning is widely discussed in psychoanalytic literature, but it doesn't really, I haven't found, it doesn't get the end product, because actually, here's the thing about the psyche. The psyche is naturally ecological. You cannot throw anything away. It's always recycling. Yeah.
Right.
You like to throw things away, but you can't. That's what, So what happens is that when you dissociate with something, it has this tendency of popping up somewhere else. And this is what happened, in a way, this is what Freud discovered right at the beginning. And it needed to be taken much more seriously, because Freud started working with symptoms that appeared in the body, which seemed to be generated by experiences or thoughts. Yeah. So you have experience or thoughts which are non-tangible events in consciousness, which then turn into measurable problems in the body, which are then experienced as physical pain or something like that. And that's where he started, trying to make that connection with the idea that if we actually identify what these thoughts or experiences were, or traumas, for example, then the physical symptoms would go away. So that's part of that same system. So the psyche, you can't throw it away. So if you strongly disown things, it's going to pop up somewhere else. And in fact, if you have someone really next to you who's vulnerable or incompetent, it reinforces your own dissociation of incompetence and your own identification with being the competent one. So what I've seen in a lot of marriages with boarding school survivors is boarding school survivors often marry people who seem quite vulnerable, embody the vulnerable. Yeah.
I think everyone, to a certain degree, attracts partners that embody aspect of themselves they aren't aware of, or are trying to integrate, or are drawn to in some way. So that doesn't surprise me.
That's the nature
of
the psyche.
Manifest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
I know in my own relationship, every time my wife does something that triggers me or bothers me, I have to go into myself and go, okay, what part of this is me? And it's always something, right? I'm always like, oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course I'm bothered by that. I wasn't allowed to do that growing up, or I wasn't allowed to feel that, or exactly. I had I went with the opposite coping strategy,
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that it would show up that way for people who went through this particular trauma.
Yeah. But so what happens then, you get that happening on a societal scale. Then it starts to get really a bit funky, because look at, for example, the British working classes. In as much as we can generalize about such things, and and some people say it's not possible to do it, but in general terms, you see, the British society, I mean, we never created a social democracy like in France or in the Netherlands or Germany or Sweden or places like this. Yeah, we have this quite top-down society still. And you have a situation in Britain where the middle classes are all afraid of their builders, for example. There's a tremendous difference, and it's in the accent. You don't have it quite so much in the States. You have rich and poor, and that you're tuned into that. But we're tuned into accents. We place everybody in class and locality immediately. It's second nature to us. And we've got kind of the generalization I'm hesitating in voicing here is that you could say is that the British working classes hold the depression of the upper classes. That the upper classes don't want to identify with. It's very poor social solidarity. You'll see that in Britain now, voting for Conservatives. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas. In the time when there was football hooliganism, the British were the worst. Yeah. There's a kind of a rawness, a wildness, and anger in the British working classes. And my mad hypothesis, this has to do with how much pain that the elite have disowned, dissociated, and projected out. And as we were saying earlier, I was trying to say the projection at that level is not a conscious phenomenon. It happens by itself. It's part of the function of this psyche that's always recycling. Yeah.
That is the part that fascinates me the most about this, and also the part that I think a lot of people have a challenge conceptualizing or often resistant to. That, we understand that in a personal relationship or in a marriage or in a friendship, you might project things on your friend, or you might attract people who are in some way reflecting parts of yourself that you're unconscious of or have disowned. But this idea or theory taken to its logical conclusion implies that actually, if everyone had a very similar childhood or had experienced similar things, that you might have entire social classes engaged in the same thing, where they're both projecting on each other, or you might have different entire racial groups who have had different upbringings that are also projecting on each other, or saying like, oh, that other group over there has this quality that maybe they do, also maybe they don't, because it's coming from a psychological projection. And one of the things that really interested me, Ork, was the idea that much of the behavior of leadership is based in these early traumas and psychological projections. So I'm wondering, for the group that went through boarding schools, what is their behavior at the leadership level? And are there some examples of that you could give, or are there some specific things that maybe people have seen in the world that they don't recognize as coming from these early childhood experiences?
Certainly in the British case, I would go back to the things I've been talking about earlier, the entitlement complex and the strategic survival personality. And partly the strategic survival, one of the things about the strategic survival personality, it cannot admit that it's wrong. So that, for example, probably the most competent and creative leader that we've had in Britain in the last few years was Tony Blair, who is a product of that system, who went to a famous school in Edinburgh, boarding school. And even though he led the Labour Party,
I should add, I know so little about UK politics that I probably I will.
Labour Party is like the Democrats.
Okay, even then I'm prefacing the discussion with that, so that if I ask a question that might be obvious to someone who's involved in that's why.
Of course. Yeah. So the British Labour Party is a bit like the Democrats, although it's much more based in socialism than the Democrats. So Tony Blair took over the British Labour Party in the mid-90s and was a very successful leader of it, and sort of brought it much more into the centre, or much more to the right, some people would say. And he was a product of one of the finest, in quotes, schools, and was a terribly able man. There's no doubt about it. But he followed Bush into Iraq, and the British public have never forgiven him for that. And he's had many, many opportunities over the years to say, from quite sympathetic interviewers, maybe it was a mistake. And he won't. And there've been, and a lot of people, had he acknowledged it was a mistake, they would have perhaps opened their hearts to him again. But mostly these days, certainly in progressive politics, his name is dirt. For that reason. And what I see is that actually he's still running on his strategic survival personality. He cannot admit he was wrong. Where a much more skillful leader, such as Angela Merkel in Germany, recently made some cock up over COVID restrictions, and the following day went back to the German public and said, "Look, can you forgive me? I made a total mistake over this. Let's run this again." And it was fine, because that's completely normal, actually. So a good leader should be able to make a mistake and acknowledge it and come back from it and things like that. So that's one example. Another example is that with this kind of personality based on dissociation, what I noticed clinically is a lot of boarding school survivors harbored catastrophic fears of being found out, of being unmasked, as being revealed as being false, or being on the run in some particular way. Yeah. And so that the criticism, or the imagined criticism, is much, much more deadly than needs to be. So there's a recent example in British politics where David Cameron, the Prime Minister who led us into Brexit, out of his conflicted relationships with his own Conservative Party, was challenged in the House of Commons about one small detail. And he turned on this MP with a remarkable savagery, and tried to humiliate her, and used some line from a popular TV show in a very vicious way. I mean, what he actually said was, "Calm down, dear," and he said that repeatedly in a very, very hostile way, which at the time was big news, because in general the House of Commons meant to work in a sort of polite and civilized way. But what I saw was that he was on this point of being revealed, unmasked as a fraud or a liar or something like that. And, he'd tell the little bitty one about something, it wasn't terribly serious, but he overreacted and went in with much more hostility than necessary. So there's that fragility in the psyche of someone who's running on dissociation. And then there's the general point you can see about those entitled leaders and dealing with the vulnerable, where actually they really don't get it. They really don't get it, what it's like, to be living, from one paycheck to the other. They do not get it, because they've lived such a sort of cushioned life. What they get, what it's like is having to survive in quite a brutal institution. They can do that, but they have been shielded from the sort of everyday realities. They don't get what it's like to go into the public health care. So one of the things that happened at the start of COVID, where Boris Johnson was reputed to have got COVID, it was never quite demonstrated that he had, is that apparently he went into an NHS hospital. That's the National Health Service. That's our public health care. Whereas normally someone in his position would go into private health care because we've got these twin systems running alongside of each other. Whether he had COVID or not, I think is not proven. But he had a very difficult job, and he may have needed to be taken away from the public for a bit, for other reasons. I don't know. But what you get in this kind of character is a kind of an inflexibility, a rigidity, because what I noticed I noticed in myself first, actually, the amount of anxiety that I was running as an ex-boarder until I really noticed it and named it. Tremendous anxiety about running sort of underlying a lot, sometimes, you could say a person's whole life. When you've had 10 years living in an institution with nobody care for you, no one has got you back, 24/7, even in bed, you're not safe. The anxiety that you then run on is really enormous. And then you take it for granted. It's normal, but it isn't normal. And so that produces quite a brittle character. So it's not a resilient character. So the tendency to overreact, I believe Boris sent a gunboat to into the Channel Islands last week when there was a problem about fishing. I mean, really? Such a kind of, it didn't come to anything, luckily, because they're dealing with the French, who are actually very pragmatic. But a tendency to overreact comes out of that brittleness. You've seen it in Trump. That's similar. A fear of being unmasked, a fear of being thought a fraud, not a natural sense of confidence, not an ability to make mistakes, not an ability to empathize, to put oneself in the shoes of the others. If you haven't had empathy, if you've been taught to dissociate from your own feelings, empathy is a skill you have to relearn.
I'm curious what you think the process is for healing and integrating for people who've been through that, and especially for the people who are in leadership positions now. Because it strikes me that, anytime there's a psychological split and there's an adaptive personality created from that, I've heard it also referred to as a protector part or a protector personality. Yeah. There's a way in which it is adaptive to the situation. Like, it strikes me that someone in politics would benefit from never admitting their mistakes, from always pretending to be the most competent. There's a way in which the political system rewards that, and in which, if they were to say, actually, I'm going to share my feelings and admit my mistakes and say that I might have made a huge political, something wrong, that could be exploited by other people in the political system who are operating from instead of a healthy relationship perspective, where you're, in a healthy relationship, you could admit mistakes and you can have a conversation about it, who are operating from more of a more zero-sum way of handling politics, which is, of course, how most politics is handled. So yes. If someone is in that position and they want to heal, what would you recommend?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a good question. The first thing, it's not just the political sphere where that sort of leadership dominates. It's of course the corporate sphere as well, and you could say that that both corporate and political leadership is favors psychopathy. And when you look to studies of psychopaths that have been made over the last few years, I think people say something like 4% in the population would count as psychopaths, but actually 90% of those people are in leadership positions.
Right. It's the top of society and then the absolute bottom that's in jail.
Yes, that's right. And psychopathy has the etiology, i.e. how you become a psychopath is not known, or the jury's out, but what is known is that that the emotional intelligence is not natural. It's kind of, it is an imitative emotional style that psychopaths adopt, and that they don't have empathy, can't really deal with other people's feelings, but they're quite good at guessing them. They can't. So genuine empathy is not there, and therefore genuine shame is not there. And shame is the thing that keeps us operating in a social collective, for good and bad. Yeah, it's got its good sides and it has its bad sides, but it's that which goes towards helps us treat each other well also. So there is that phenomenon, and then there's the question. One way you could talk about the sort of work that I've been looking at is that you kind of, that there's a training for that leadership which is done by the severing of attachment. You could almost say it's a training for psychopathy. I mean, I don't say that, but you could say it. So the first thing, if anybody actually wants to heal from that, is that they have to stick their hand up and identify it and say, look, and recognize it. The first stage is recognition. I mean, this is what happened to me. I didn't have any choice in the matter. I was a child. Yeah? And that's not easy for everybody. So, and it generally, a lot of people who come to our work come when there's a life event which happens to them, like they might lose their jobs, they might have a marriage breakdown, they might have a child that's 8 years old, and they see how little that child is, and they say, oh my God, at 8 years old, I was sent away to boarding school. Oh my God, something clicks in the psyche. And so the first recognition, in a way, the house of cards starts to fall. That's the first part. There's usually quite a lot of panic and trying to rebuild. Yeah, because it's the first chapter in my first book, the making of them, when I write about the boarding school thing, and the political thing is in Wounded Leaders more. But my first chapter is called Breakdowns Can Be Breakthroughs. So there's got to be some level of breakdown first. Yeah.
In other words, the protector part, the previous personality, has to no longer be adaptive.
Well, that's correct. Or you could say that over time, the survival personality is inevitably going to turn maladaptive because it was invented by an 8-year-old. Let's say.
Right.
You see? I mean,
I see.
It's a pseudo-adult invented by the 8-year-old. It's a creation. It's a psychic structure. Not that you can find it in the brain, but it's a psychic structure created by the 8-year-old. And the fact that it might last into somebody's 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s is a miracle. But often it does, and often it breaks down in midlife. And that's that's normal, actually. And when you think about the psyche in general, you think actually the psyche is benevolent. It wants to protect you when you're little, and then it perhaps will only start to, its breakdown system will start to collapse and be maladaptive when actually you're ready to do something else now. Yeah. So hopefully, if things go right, when you have, it usually comes about though through some kind of failure, like a relationship failure or something like that, and your psyche starts to become self-reflective, and you say, oh my God, this happened to me. I grew up in an institution. What do I know about being a father, being a husband? Actually, I know nothing about, what do I know about women, and you start to acknowledge that you had quite a neglectful childhood, and how on earth could you actually come out and have healthy relationships? It's almost impossible.
In other words, you have to realize that growing up in a setting where you were completely detached from family was not good training for being in a family.
Yes, it's the worst training for intimacy, I say to people. And that's part of the acceptance stage, because the process I see, it goes recognition, acceptance, change. In the big stage is acceptance. You go in and out of acceptance and denial and trying to rebuild and so, I would say, if I'm working with a couple or something and there's terrible things going on in the relationship, I mean, I can say to the guy, for example, you're treating your wife like shit, man, you're going to lose her. I can say that, yeah. But I can also say, look, you had the worst training for intimacy. You were in a boarding school for 10 years. No wonder you don't know how to treat your wife. You've got to go back and look at this,
It sounds like too, go ahead.
Yeah. And so you've got to be in a situation where you're prepared to fall a bit. And of course, as you were hinting earlier, most leaders really don't think falling is good. but the process, I mean, they're wrong there, because when you fall a little bit, you get to see that vulnerability isn't weakness. And that when you start to engage with your vulnerability, there's a paradox happen, you become stronger. Yeah.
It sounds like those of us who are in relationship with these personalities too have to create safety for them to say they were wrong. In other words, there's a lot of people in leadership positions who are rightfully seen as high functioning sociopaths. And what would actually, the response when you meet someone who's a high functioning sociopath who has power over you is just, justifiably and understandably dislike and fear and feeling threatened by them. And so it seems very counterintuitive that you might need to create space to say, like, if you ever want to admit you might have done something wrong, I just want to know that it's okay for you to do that, and I'll still love you, and I'll still be in relationship with you. But when you see someone who's, you see someone who's destroying the world, that's not the natural intuitive response.
No, you're right. And, I come at this from two directions. One is a psychohistorian, but the other is a shrink, and I'm able to have compassion for the child in the person, whilst I'm being employed by them. I don't want to go out and vote for him. That's another story altogether. The person who comes into my room or to one of my, doing my workshops and says, I want to function, I want to learn how to recover or function differently or not how to lose my wife. I take that very, very seriously, because that's a mark of tremendous courage, which I respect. But I'm not saying everybody can do it. You can't, you get, for example, gets to a point in a marriage where a wife may have been so badly treated that you can't expect her to have sympathy for what I see as a clinician. I see the boy in that person, you see? That's second nature to me now. And when I train people to do this work, I train them to see that. And so I have compassion for them when they're in the room, or when they're saying they want to go on a journey towards recovery or healing or be treated, but not when they're hiding that boy behind a competent person who is actually going to stand for office and not understand vulnerable, not understand communal situations, not actually understand that the Europeans aren't just Johnny Foreigner who you have to chase off with a gunboat. No, that's not, my compassion doesn't go that far.
It sounds like they have to first commit to that process of change or healing.
Of course.
And we can invite them to do that, but and until they do, then there's still a leader who's in a position where they're potentially harming others.
Sure.
So before we finish up, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to add, or that you want to say on this subject, or anything that I didn't ask that you really would, that maybe I should have or could have?
Well, I mean, I suppose the only thing I would want to say is probably the more difficult one, is that, say in the British context, the fact that we have this sort of, I think we got 7 or 8% currently of people who go to private schools, and out of that, there's 1 or 2% who board. It's a tiny number. And then you've got 60% or something in the cabinet at the moment of those boarders. So the extent of the top-downness is not, this very small group, and how we keep training that. It affects the whole society in Britain, so that kind of everybody wants to be like that and to invent themselves like that. And the fact that this particular group were the architects of the British colonial project, which is the most successful colonial project in human history, way exceeds that of the Romans, for example. Yeah, and when I was a boy, and the atlas, most of the world was pink which is the British color in the atlas for Canada and Australia and South Africa and East Africa. Of course, we lost America, didn't we, rather foolishly, just not by giving those idiots the vote, completely stupid. That would have been pink too. But this Anglophone system has made a massive impact on the whole globe. Yeah. And even though it's still a tiny percentage, and your average listener in Houston may not imagine it has anything to do with them. Or where Austin? Did you say Austin? Yeah.
Austin, Texas, yes.
Austin, Texas. May not think it has anything to do with it, but actually, it's been a major shape of the globe over the last 200 period, what the British colonial project has done. And it is direct morphing, I think, into capitalism and into that, what we were talking about earlier, the sort of the normalization of the psychopathic CEO, for example. It's in a direct tradition line, I think. So it's not a minor issue on some funky little tourist nation, on the edge of Europe. It's a major problem. That's how I see it. Yeah.
There's a meme format where you have like a very tiny domino leading to a larger one, and you could almost draw a line between like an 8-year-old boy getting bullied at boarding school, and then on the other end, global capitalism and colonialization. The entire world speaking English.
I know.
It's amazing how such a small thing can lead.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not a small thing. It's a very emotionally big thing for a person.
And I appreciate that you see this, Brendon. And the thing is, once you and it's rare that you see it, but once you see it, I mean, bad luck, mate, you can't stop seeing it anymore. It's like, you just can't stop seeing it.
Well, that's the thing I'm thinking about too, is that you could do a whole analysis of, how the American public school system impacts people psychologically, or private religious education, or all of the different ways that children have been raised. And I imagine each of those systems has a slightly different psychological impact, none of which seem totally good to me.
Yeah. Well, underlying all this, there's a huge philosophical question: is socialization of children a good thing, and to what extent should we be doing it? And those are the sort of questions you mentioned earlier that people are looking at in the unschooling sort of movements and that sort of thing. It's another question. I'm not really taking that one on. I've got enough on my shoes. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your work with me and the people who listen. If people want to learn more about this, where should they go?
Well, we've got a website called boardingschoolsurvivors.co.uk, and there's several books now about boarding, because they've started to domino a bit. But you can have a look. Go to amazon.co.uk, because they're not so available in the States. You can order them there. You'll if you look for my book, The Making of Them, or Wounded Leaders, it will lead you on to the others. But they're readily audible from amazon.co.uk. Or
we'll put links in the show notes, and I think the American versions are available on Kindle, so can get that too.
There's Kindle there, but be careful if you order a paperback from Amazon.com. It might cost you $100 or something. Yeah, okay.
Money well spent.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Same. Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.